I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're exploring the murky world of food date labeling, which can come with various terms and somewhat nebulous definitions. To provide some clarity and potentially reduce unnecessary food waste in New York, Democratic lawmakers are pushing food labeling legislation in Albany. For more on this effort, we're joined in the studio by Claire Walsh Winsler, Director of Food, Agriculture, and Land Use for Environmental Advocates NY. So you're looking for more standardization of food date labeling and specifically prohibiting the use of the phrase, quote unquote, sell by. So what is it about the current landscape that doesn't work? And I guess what's so bad about sell by language?
Absolutely. So the funny thing about this bill is folks often think we have more rules and standards than we really do. Mm-hmm. So right now there's only federal rules on date labeling when it comes to infant formula and shellfish, which those are clearly very important food items to be protective of, but we want to see some more expansive standards. And so right now food producers can put really anything they want on the date label component. It can be transfer by, shelf on, sell by, use by. We got an enjoy by once, which one of my colleagues thought was funny. Like a threat, you must enjoy this salad by March 1st.
Sure.
But right now there's really not a lot of rules. And this bill doesn't mandate that food producers put a date label on the food. But if they're going to do a date label, then it means that it should be something understandable, something comprehensive, and something consumer facing as well. Like a lot of sell by, for example, is more on the store side of things in terms of the information provided that's useful. And so this bill just sets some guidelines for these date labels, which I think we should have had them from the beginning.
And you mentioned the federal perspective. It's my understanding that the USDA, while they provide guidelines, they're not legally enforceable or actively policing any of this stuff, right?
Yeah. And there's a federal bill that was introduced in 2015 that in the long term, we would love to see the New York State bill be a part of a federal solution on this. But unfortunately, we haven't seen movement on that federal bill in over a decade now. And so passing it through states like California, where it passed a couple years ago, and in New York State this year, hopefully, can be a path forward to more expansive, generalized standards across the country.
Yeah, I want to come back to what California is putting in place, I believe, starting in July of this year. But sticking with what we're proposing here in New York, what terms do you want to see potentially used that might be useful to consumers?
So what's included in the bill is a use by and a best if use by. So a safety date and a quality date, which, rather than sell by or enjoy by, gives the consumer actual information around when the peak quality of the food is and when the safety of the food is too, which is information that's actually helpful for us when we're determining whether or not something is still good to eat.
Well, which is which in that situation? Because I don't necessarily think it's as clear as if you said safe by, which would probably really scream to people, don't eat this after this date.
Danger.
Sure.
Yeah. Best if used by is the quality date. Use by is the safety date. And so one of the things in drafting this legislation the sponsors were careful of is we want to make sure that the standards match what is already going on in California and what's proposed in the federal bill as well. Because we hear from businesses all the time that a patchwork of state regulation is really difficult for them to comply with across state lines. And so making sure that this bill has the same terms as California was a priority for pulling something forward that can be really actionable.
And what about how those terms are determined? Are you looking to spell out how food manufacturers go about deciding when something is safe, or do you leave some wiggle room there in terms of how they are able to determine that?
There's a regulatory process in the bill with Ag and Markets and the Department of Health in talking about shelf life quality, determining some of those standards. But in general, this is on the business. Again, there's no requirement that they do a date label, and they're doing those standards internally right now. The bill also asks that businesses use a scientifically determined method, which is also under Ag and Markets, to determine what those methods would be. So there's some standards in place to make sure they can't just, slap whatever they want on there and call it a day. It expires tomorrow. But this is on the business to figure out what makes the most sense.
What if I'm a business and then say, whatever we're doing now works for us, the system works for us, and if you want to pose additional restrictions on what it should look like, well, we'll just pull all the labels off. We won't use any best by dates. We won't even try to guess when it's safe by. If that happens, isn't that a potential loss for consumers?
I think the misinformation is worse than no information in that case. I would say, though, most businesses aren't coming up with a random process for determining safety. And I would imagine if you were a food producer, the system you have in place is something that would already work with the future regulations around a safe method for determining the food date label. But I do think that, if there's no date, what I do, I look at it, I smell it. I'm a little more cautious than my husband, especially because I'm 7 months pregnant in terms of, the food that I'm willing to eat. But if there's no date label, I think we rely a little bit more on our senses. Then if there's a sell-by date, people assume that means it's expired afterwards and will throw it out. So I think the worst case scenario is misinformation.
Well, it is interesting that you bring up that different threshold that people have, and I see that in my own life with myself versus my mom. And I wonder whether there is a meaningful definition that you think can be used for people, because it seems like this is kind of an ambiguous threshold for when someone is still willing to try that milk, for example.
Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, people should eat what they feel comfortable eating. And everyone is naturally going to have different thresholds for food safety and what they feel comfortable with. We hear this all the time, actually, talking about this bill. There's usually one partner in the marriage who is a little more daring than the other. Sometimes I've heard folks call this the relationship harmony bill, because it can help solve some misinformation and confusion around when food is actually good. And so at the end of the day, I think people should eat what they feel safe eating. Right now, there's no guidelines around what these date labels actually look like. And so, we're not trying to have people eat food that's not good anymore or they don't feel comfortable eating. But this is, around 20% of food waste can be attributed to confusion around food date labels. That's a big swath of the problem, 1/5. And so if we can attack that problem by something as simple as putting in some guidelines for date labels, that's a big chunk of our food insecurity problem with grocery prices being so high and methane emissions from landfills. It attacks this problem from different angles. So we think, it's worth moving forward on.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Claire Walsh Winsler, Director of Food, Agriculture, and Land Use for Environmental Advocates, and why. The role that the state would play in something like this, how demonstrably different would that be from what, say, the Department of Ag and Markets does now in New York? And if this is a heavy lift in terms of enforcement and oversight, would we need to see additional resources for the department if they were to successfully implement something like this?
Yeah, I think the existing regulatory staff that Ag and Markets has doing the process for determining the education, which right now is sort of putting up a flyer and putting up a website, and doing the shelf-stable regs as well, we feel that it's not a notable fiscal with the existing resources that Ag and Markets have, and they do have a whole section that covers food safety, which this would fall under. So we don't feel like it's a demonstrably larger impact.
Well, let's turn to the West Coast, where, as I mentioned, they are implementing some of their own language requirements in, I believe, July. Can you talk about what, if anything, you're hearing about the effort to comply with that? Are you aware of any businesses that are lighting their hair on fire, bringing lawsuits, or does it seem from across the coast like this is going pretty smoothly and will be implemented without any major headaches?
Mm-hmm. Jumping into the Pacific, perhaps.
Sure.
Yeah, we really haven't heard anything. And in drafting this bill, in working on this campaign, we worked with stakeholders in California to understand what went well in their process, in any hiccups that came up, groups that were had problems and how they were resolved, and so incorporated that into our understanding of this bill. I will say as well, this is a problem, an environmental problem, that a lot of large food companies are really interested in solving. There is a bill, especially for this at the federal level, where we have tons of huge companies like Whole Foods and Kroger, brand name grocery stores that have signed on in support of date labeling because they understand this is a simple, low fiscal way to reduce food waste and improve consumer information and combat misinformation. So it's not one we're really hearing industry fighting back against.
For the groceries, is there interest in the sense that they won't necessarily need to throw food away that's sitting on their shelves that might not be as appealing to people because it has a sell-by or transfer date that might be scaring people away? Or is there some other, maybe less self-interested reason why they might be supporting something like this?
I'd like to think it's less self-interested.
Okay.
I think food waste is actually an issue where a lot of disparate groups come together. We're really excited to be fighting this campaign not only with other environmentalists, but with food banks and hunger advocates from across the state, with business leaders. I have never been scared away by a food package by the sell-by date. That hasn't dissuaded me from buying something before. So I don't think that this will create a crazy change of the shelving life of a lot of these grocery stores. But so I'd like to think that they do actually want to fix this problem, and this feels something very actionable to them.
So definitions in terms like transfer by and sell by probably don't have any meaningful implications for the consumer, but they might have some sort of back-end ramifications. So are those dates still going to be allowed to be noted in some shape or fashion on the food labels so that the manufacturers, the retailers, whoever might need that information can, scan the device and still take it away and be, aware of that information that they're trying to convey?
For sure. And that's specifically written into the bill because we do understand sell-by has important connotations for the manager of the grocery store for understanding their stock, but it just isn't helpful for consumers. And so it's specifically labeled in the bill that if there's a back-end approach, scanning it, whatever their internal system is, that the information should be provided there. It just shouldn't be slapped on the front of the product.
And in terms of existing inventory, if this bill were to become law, would things have to be just pulled down from the shelves, or somebody's got to go around with a Sharpie and clean everything up? Or could they still sell off that existing inventory?
Definitely not. So our goal is to reduce food waste.
Okay.
And so it's, again, specifically noted in the bill language that this applies to manufacturers, not to sales of the food. And so everything that's on the shelf with the pre-existing labels, our goal is for it to be sold and kind of passed through the system, and then new items to be labeled in the new way. It also specifically says that any food with the improper labeling after the effective date is totally free to be donated as well to food banks, to hunger relief organizations, because again, we want to make sure food that is good ends up on their tables, in their stomachs. We want to prevent it from going to the landfill.
Well, we've been speaking with Claire Walsh Winsler. She's the Director of Food, Agriculture, and Land Use for Environmental Advocates NY. Thanks for visiting us in the studio, Claire.
Thanks for having me.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.